Hello, hi. So, I am launching a new series, a new video series on this channel where I talk about the historical horror that Black people have endured just all over the world. I'll probably center it around, Black Americans, but there's definitely some horrific stories out there about Black people in other countries. And the series, I'm working on a title, but I think we're going to call it You Missed a Part. And it is essentially addressing the different elements of history that we are not taught, some different stories that we do not learn and that we end up having to stumble across to kind of identify and learn more about. And so the first story is a fairly straightforward one, a fairly simple one, but no less horrific. And I actually saw it kind of the initial beginning of the story on Twitter. A Twitter user shared it, and I was like, that's something that could be worth diving into. And so I did. So let's set the scene. We are in the 1950s. So it's Jim Crow America. We're out of slavery, of course, but we're still dealing with Jim Crow, and racism is becoming more institutionalized now because, Black people are no longer enslaved. And so the white people had to figure out a way to maintain the status quo, even though slavery was abolished and had, for all intents and purposes, was no longer actively happening. Now, we all know that that's not true in various ways, but for the most part, that is kind of where we are. And so we are going to tell the story of Mr. Clennon Washington King Jr. And Clennon Washington King Jr. was born July 18th, 1920. And he died February 12, 2000. So he is basically the age of, if you are a Gen Xer, of your grandparents, possibly even if you're an older millennial, like grandparent age, if you're a boomer, your parents, depending. But this is someone who lived in our current time, but this is still historical horror. And for definition's sake, history is anything that happened in the past. So it can be something horrific that happened a week ago, 2 months ago, 100 years ago, etc. Because this historically horrific things still affect us to this day. And so this is just really my kind of foray into shedding light on some of these stories that people may or may not know. And so we are now talking about Mr. Clennon Washington King Jr. Now, Clennon came from a large family. And so he had a lot of brothers and sisters. He was the eldest of 7 children. And his family was very big in civil rights. So his father, Clennon Washington King Sr., was a civil rights activist, and he was Booker T. Washington's chauffeur. So his family was definitely plugged into the movement in a very intimate way. I'm sure I don't personally have a chauffeur and doesn't have an experience with being a driver, but I can imagine, like, if I had the same Uber driver for a bit of my life, that I would get to know that person pretty well. And so, being that he was Booker T. Washington's chauffeur, I'm sure he heard some interesting conversations, probably engaged in some interesting conversations just as a result of who he was driving around on a regular basis. And he also, one of his younger brothers was a lawyer. And actually his name is C.B. King, and he has a United States courthouse in Albany, Georgia, named after him. So he's definitely, in one of those notable families of Black excellence and, striving to be the best, to do the best, and kind of show up in these professional ways. And so Clennon, though, he expressed his search for civil rights in very interesting ways. And so one of the things that he did, he wanted to have his, you could tell when I read his story that he wanted to be I don't know if he just wanted to be famous or if he wanted to be noteworthy and kind of, play a role in the movement or, change things. But he was definitely a person who went out of his way to kind of challenge the status quo. The thing that I saw about him that kind of brought him on my radar and was a really horrific story was that in 1957, he decided he wanted to go to the University of Mississippi for grad school. So prior to that, in that same year, he tried to have one of his children integrate an all-white elementary school in Mississippi. That didn't go so well. But then he's like, you know what? I want to go to grad school. I'm going to apply to the University of Mississippi. Now, reminder, this is Jim Crow South. And so, the University of Mississippi is not an HBCU. So needless to say, he applied. Because you apply, you don't submit a picture, you just kind of share your name and your information. And he was well qualified when he applied. It wasn't like he was, it was for grad school. So he already had his necessarily diplomas and things and other degrees in order to be able to apply for grad school. And so he was accepted. When he showed up to register for classes, that's when things got a little dicey. And, I don't know if the police or, in general were just on high alert at that time, because just everything that I've ever read, the 50s was definitely a time where things were being integrated. Black people were showing up and going to various places where white people felt like they weren't allowed. And so I don't know if that's where this was, but when he showed up to register for classes, the authorities forcibly removed him from the area. So that's crazy enough. Like, I'm just trying to go to school and get a degree. I guess Clennon was like, I'm not going to try to apply to any of the HBCUs. I am going to go to University of Mississippi. They have a program I like. I'm not sure. Definitely didn't give us any context about what he was thinking, but that, is my thought. Funnily enough, I actually applied for, I applied for Mississippi State University and was potentially granted a scholarship there, but didn't like where the campus was located, because like it was literally, you're driving on the expressway and then in the middle of nowhere here's this campus, and I just did not see myself going to college somewhere we were literally in the middle of nowhere. That did not sound fun to me. But he wants to go to U of M, University of Mississippi, and he got in, but they forcibly removed him. So that he got there, he's about to register for classes and get his learning on, and they were like, no, it's a no for us. They removed him. They took it a step further because he had the audacity in their mind to apply to go to the University of Mississippi. They were like, this man must be crazy. He's got to be mentally unstable and we need to lock him up. And sure enough, they took him to the Whitfield State Mental Hospital for evaluation. Not because he showed up and he exhibited behaviors of someone who, had mental challenges and needed to be kind of looked at by a doctor. Not because he did anything that made them think that he needed to be checked. They just thought, this man has the audacity. And if because he has this audacity, he has to be mentally unwell. And therefore, we have to check him into a state mental hospital. I'm pausing for effect because think about that. You are just applying, Clennon is just out here in the world. Like, I want to get a graduate degree. I want to further my education. His dad is a civil rights activist. His younger brother is an attorney. Their family is very civil rights minded. And he's just like, I want to get my grad degree so that I can, further my education. And because of that, they thought that they locked him up in a state mental hospital. That's the horror. Like, that's ridiculous that this man is treated this way. And they decided that he had to be insane to think that he could attend the University of Mississippi in 1957. 1957. Some of our parents were born in the 50s, not grandparents, parents. And it's, I wanted to tell these stories, and because for me history is going to be a very broad term that applies, like I said, to things that happened last week, to things that could have happened, you know, hundreds of years ago, because it's important to, one, bring these stories to light, but also to just underscore the craziness of when you see people saying things like, well, that happened so long ago, you know, you should, like, why are you still complaining about slavery? Why are you still complaining about Jim Crow? Like, that was so long ago. But it wasn't. We're only one generation shy of Jim Crow. Like, and this man in 1957 just wanted to go to grad school, and he was put into a state mental hospital because the authorities were like, he has got to be insane for this black man to think that he could go to the University of Mississippi. And he was actually in the hospital for 2 weeks before his younger brother, who was an attorney, his name was C.B. King, he was able to secure his release. Like, that is craziness that this man was treated this way, and it was simply because of racism. And that, you know, that's horrific. Like, that is beyond. But I will say, you know, once Clennon got out of the state mental hospital, he continued to push the envelope, and he continued to work to change the status quo. He actually, funnily enough, he ran for different political offices, and he actually ran to be the president of the United States. He continued to, you know, try to push change. Now, one of the things that he is not so positively remembered for is that he was very outspoken about his feelings about Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement. And he actually was one of the people who was against segregation. And he had written a lot of anti-segregation articles in, you know, various newspapers. And actually, he was on staff at Alcorn Agricultural and Mining College, which is now Alcorn State. And they actually protested him being part of the faculty, and they were like, you've got to go. And so because of that, the university let his contract expire. But, you know, he was definitely an envelope pusher. But for him to be placed, I'm sure, you know, he sounds like the type of person, he was probably radicalized at a very young age, especially with your father being the chauffeur of Booker T. Washington. I'm sure that probably contributed to him kind of wanting to push for civil rights. But I'm sure him being forcibly placed at a state mental hospital just for attempting to go to grad school didn't change his views, and maybe even pushed him to kind of go even further to try to make a change. And, you know, some people might think that him being against segregation would be misguided, but at that time there were a good contingent of black people who were against segregation, because in their mind, you know, when things were separate, they were better, because they you know, you could see, like, this was a time where, you know, you had like black communities that were thriving, black businesses, and a lot of times you had those out of necessity because black people had to live and function, and so they had to create to create our own ecosystems in which to live. And there were plenty of people who felt like segregation would break that down. And there are some people to this day that feels like segregation is has been a downfall. I don't know that I necessarily agree or disagree. It's something that I would want to look into more to just try to understand the perspectives. But he was one of those people. And it's just, you know, I never would have learned about him if I hadn't have seen a random thread on Twitter. And so that is the story of Clennon Washington King Jr., who was put in a state mental hospital for applying to grad school at the University of Mississippi. And that is my first story for my new series, You Missed a Part. Because whenever someone's talking about, history and what happened in the past and how people lived in that time, they often miss the part about a black man wanting to apply to go to grad school and being placed in a mental hospital. That's one of those stories that you don't necessarily hear. So I will include some of the sources that I found in my research down below, in the link below. And we'll love to hear your thoughts. Also, if you have some small unsung stories about things, crazy, horrific things that happened to black people in the past, and like I said, history can be last week, history can be hundreds of years ago. Share them with me. I would love to learn more about these, more stories that I can research and share with you on my channel. So I hope that you learned a little something, and that it inspires you in some way. If anything, just inspires you to subscribe so that you can hear more of these stories, or come back to hear more, or comment below what your thoughts are, because it was an eye-opener for me. So I will be back with another story, and I look forward to the next time that we can talk again. Bye.